Hello class, my name is Dale Queen and today I'd like to talk to you about conflict and negotiation in organizations. This is chapter 15 from our text. Conflict can be found in every corner of organizations and business throughout the world and in interpersonal lives as well. Conflict is so common that we have metaphors that we use for conflict. For example, we say that conflict is explosive. We use phrases such as, "Any little thing will set him off," or "Jim has a short fuse." Maybe conflict is seen as a trial. We can say that he has the best case, or "I don't know, the jury's still out on that." Or even conflict is a mess. You may say everything is breaking down around here, or "Hey, you just opened up a can of worms." In other words, conflict is all around us. So before we start talking about conflict, let's go ahead and define conflict according to our text. Conflict is a process resulting in the perception of two parties that are working in opposition to each other in ways that produce feelings of discomfort and or animosity. And I'd like to add something to that it also may involve scarce resources, such as money, time, and we'll talk about that here in just a few minutes. So let's start looking at the four forms of conflict. They are task, process, relationship, and legal. Let's look at task conflict first. Task conflict is conflict regarding the goals and the content of the work. I used to work at a refinery here in Kentucky, and we would have to do some shutdowns twice a year. And every day that one of the unit was shut down, the company lost $800,000 a day. So you can imagine the conflict and the tension that was going on in the departments. What we would usually try to do is we'd have other people from other units come in to help us work. So you'd have the other operators, engineers, and maintenance people. Problem was, the other units done their job differently than we did. So they would come in and we'd say, well, this is how we do things here, or we don't do things that way. So that was more of a task conflict. The second one is process conflict, where parties agree on the goals and the content, but disagree on how to achieve those goals. When I worked at that refinery, certain units would have different jobs depending on the year. If we were going to produce naphtha or naphthene, depending on the shift, when we would come into work, they would say you need to produce 1,200 gallons before the shift is over. If it was a 10-hour shift, some of us would rather work through our breaks and take a shorter lunch and then have a couple hours of downtime before shift change. Other people wanted to work the entire shift and take longer breaks, usually smoke breaks, and take a long lunch and then finish up right at shift change. We both agreed that we had to get the 1,200 gallons, but we had different ideas on how to achieve those. The third is the relationship conflict, and this is where parties have interpersonal issues. Me being one of the few Christians that was working in our unit at lunchtime, I usually got offended by the off-color jokes and hearing the Lord's name in vain said throughout the day. I would defend myself, and usually this ended up in some type of conflict. And the last one is legal conflict. This is the difference in perceptions between organizations. This refinery that I worked at, about 150 yards to 200 yards outside of the main gates, there was a gas station that sold the product of gasoline that we refined. Problem was that gas station had some of the highest prices in the area. A lot of people kept saying that the refinery was doing some price fixing. Now, the text talks a lot about different types of conflict and causes. I'm going to focus on two. The first one is intergroup conflict, and the second is interorganizational conflict. So let's look at intergroup conflict. This is where two or more groups have something in common, but they have some conflict going on between them. For example, at a college you may have the science department and the business department battling over money, which is scarce resources. Maybe the science department wants to buy more equipment and the business department wants to buy some programs for the accounting department. Well, they're both battling over something that there's not a lot of, which would be the scarce resource, in this case would be money. The second is interorganizational conflict. This is conflict between two or more organizations. There was a story about a steel mill that had a contract with a major car manufacturing company, and the car manufacturing company ended up dropping their negotiation that was supposed to have gone on for 5 years. The steel manufacturing company went to the airwaves and said, we don't want anybody to buy this automobile. They even had the automobile sitting in front of the front gates of the steel mill and allowed people to come up with sledgehammers and beat the car. So there was conflict going on between those two groups. There's 5 main reactions that people have when it comes to conflict. There's avoidance, accommodation, competition, collaboration, and compromise. Let's look at the first one, avoidance. Avoidance is where people feel it may be unimportant. They may hope it will end. They may stick their heads in the sand. I call this a lose-lose. I lose and you lose on this. Managers may choose to avoid this type of conflict, and they may be uncooperative. The problem is this could spiral out of control and explode sometime in the future. But at other times, this could be used if you want a cooling off period and then negotiate a few days later. The second is accommodation. This is very friendly. This is where maybe departments in the same organization need something, a scarce resource. It could be a meeting room. And they start negotiating back and forth. Maybe one group will say, well, we can use it from 9 to 10, and the other group will say, well, we'll use it from 11 to 12. This is kind of a lose-win. I lose and you win. I'll give up something so we can have some peace. This is very friendly, and sometimes you don't want to rock the boat. You'll just let it go. The third is competition. Only one person or one group can reach the goal. We see this maybe in jobs where there's one position that's going to be open, and you might have 10 people competing for that position. So the scarce resource in this would be a position. This is a I win, you lose. Sometimes people want to win at all costs. The next one is collaboration. This is where departments work together for a common good. And this is what we dealt with when I worked at the refinery. We'd have maintenance and engineers, operators, and laborers all working to produce a common good, which was our product. This is a win-win. Everybody wins and the company wins. The last one is compromise. This is what we see when we look at union and management negotiations. People try to find the middle ground. It's a lose-win, lose-win. I lose some things and you win, but then you lose some things and I win. We both find common ground. It's good for quick resolutions. There is usually a willingness to ration the object of conflict and accept solutions. So what happens next? Well, how do we manage conflict? First, we need to attempt to find the source, and once we find the source, we can use words to try to eliminate or alleviate conflict. Besides using I and you and pointing our finger, we can use we. It's about us. It's teamwork. And especially the tone of voice that we use. We can use quiet tones rather than forceful, aggressive tones. Also, we can use task forces. If there's something going on in a company, you can have one person be representative out of each department, and they can come together and try to find a resolution. Or we can do some team building. We used to do this at the refinery where I worked. Right before we'd do a shutdown, we'd have a lot of us to get together and come up with a project. One time we had to build a bridge out of nothing but cardboard and glue, and that bridge had to span 2 feet between 2 tables, and it had to be able to support 2 textbooks. It was kind of something fun and creative, but it kind of let us work together as a team before we went out in the plant and started working. So, the next thing I'd like to do is to pose a question for you. If a win-win situation is the best, why don't more organizations adopt this approach? Thank you for your time, and I look forward to reading your responses.